Hello and welcome to the Unwelcome Podcast. I am Mark Owsley, your host, and thank you all for being here. If you're here, if you're not, that's great. And you're watching later. Thanks for being here then. Um, First, I've got to say this. If you enjoy or appreciate the work that I'm doing, please like, subscribe, and share uh, this channel and this video, and hit that bell. Let everybody so you can let yourself know that when I pop on to do some videos, I would appreciate that. But the reason I brought you here today, or the reason I'm doing this cast, is because of a really an excellent article written on the Fair Substack that I just have some good faith issues with, and I would like to discuss it. And um, I just want to point this out that if Angel, the author is Angel Eduardo, who, if he wants to come on the podcast and discuss it, I'd be more than willing to have him. And so just to make that offer, Angel, if you're out there, if you're listening, if you hear about this, let me know, and I would be happy to have you on to talk about your article. But I just wanted to bring up some stuff that I have issues with, and again, a majority of this article I agree with. Okay, I mean, I think that he goes through some very fine points when it comes to microaggressions and things like that. Um, but I just wanted to talk about some parts where I'm not necessarily in agreement, and really, it's with the premise of the article, and that um, DEI itself can be a good thing. Now, I understand his sentiment, and it is a good faith. It is a good faith sentiment. I want to point that out. Fair has done a lot of good works. I used to be a Fair chapter leader, so I want to point that out. And as far as I know, we left on okay terms. But I had some other things that I was doing, but I just that's just full disclosure. But I wanted to bring up this article. I'm going to read most of it because I think that any critique of anything like that needs to be as in full context as possible. So let me just start sharing it, and we'll start going through, because I don't want to straw man any of his argument. That's one thing I want to be careful of. Um, and hey, see you, Sophia. Thanks for sharing this for me. I appreciate it. Good to see you here, my friend. If you all don't follow Sia Sophia's channel, you need to go do that. She is awesome. See, if you put go ahead and put your channel in my chat here, and make sure everybody follows her. She does really great work on science and dissecting kind of the woke attack on science. So follow her. Yeah, so let's get into this. I want to start here. So the author here, this is from the Fair, the Foundation Against Tolerance Racism Substack account. Good account. I recommend it on my Substack, um, and they offer a lot of diverse viewpoints, which I think is great. Public with diverse viewpoints, I think I have one as well. And rather than pounding out an article, I just figured I would talk about it, because I honestly am a little better that way, and I think I can just expound a little bit. And again, Angel, great article. I think it's a great article. I think I value your opinion, and if you want to come on and talk about it, I'm more than happy and willing to have you come on and do that. But so the title of the article is DEI Can Be a Good Thing, but It Often Isn't. Okay, so I'm just going to start here at the beginning. Years ago, he starts, he had an old job. I watched as the office assistant delivered a box to the wrong person. There was a brief, awkward exchange before it dawned on him. There were two short, slender Korean women with long black hair and glasses in our office, and he had confused one for the other. He instantly turned lobster red and began apologizing. This awkwardness was contagious, and I joined in my office mates in cringing as he shuffled out the room, box in hand, his head bowed in shame. Okay, and so he's presenting a situation that sometimes can happen, where a person mistakes one person of another race for the other, and I mean, this is something we've seen before. Okay. Um, the first question I would pose is, how could and I'm just kind of taking you through my thought process as I read this article. racial. How could any DEI training prevent that situation from happening? That's my first thing. And I'm not saying it can't. That's just my first question. Okay. So he said an office mate, there were two Korean ladies present, and the man mistaken one for the other, couldn't tell them apart, basically. Um, and he didn't identify the race of the person who made the mistake, which is interesting, and maybe good, because I think it can happen to white, black, even, you know, uh, it happens across racial lines, basically. So, and then he continues. How should we understand this incident? How should it be handled? According to the diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI training I would take years later for another job, what I had witnessed that day was a racial microaggression. C, the office assistant was what we in our race obsessed world would call a white man. Okay, so he does identify it. And I remember reading that earlier. Sorry. Um, and because the Korean woman was a person of color, this incident was no mere mistake. And because the Korean woman was a person of color, this incident was no mere mistake. It was evidence of the office assistant's deep seated racism, and the proper response to it was to censure and scorn. Okay. And he's pointing out that the obvious negative parts that he agrees are in a lot of DEI trainings, and I appreciate that. I wasn't looking forward to that DEI training when I found out about it. When I'd heard all of their startling inefficacy and counterproductivity, and the havoc many of them, particularly those in the vein of Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, tended to wreak on workplaces. To wreak on workplaces. Sorry. We covered many of the things I expected: implicit bias, privilege, and offensive language and humor. Okay. And he continues, I had plenty of thoughts about the ways that these topics were discussed, but in general, the thrust of it struck me as both reasonable and understandable, particularly in the context of a workplace. We all have blind spots and biases. Okay. It wasn't until my first office job that I realized I'd spent much of my life in a kind of bubble. All of my friends were artists and creatives, and we had grown up with an extremely unfiltered way of being, thinking, and speaking. As a result, my language and humor were freewheeling in a way that I did not realize was beyond the pale for many in my office. And because of this, I spent an inordinate amount of time speaking with the head of HR. Okay, so he's describing a situation where he came from a more artistic background, where he had more freedom of speech with people that had trusted and trusted him, and that would often lend to a comfort in speaking, right? That he's saying wouldn't be considered or wasn't considered appropriate in his office setting. Okay, I think that's a common happening, but I want you to keep that incidence in your mind in the way he kind of described that, because I think therein lies kind of the crux of where might start to disagree. Okay, so but and a premise that I might start to disagree with, but it is a point, and it is a valid point. Okay, and then he continues. It hadn't occurred to me that when the world I occupied wasn't shared by everyone, that the world I occupied wasn't shared by anyone. It was a good lesson, and I appreciate the grace in which my errors were pointed out. Okay, and then he goes into his issues with it. My trouble with the training came when we discussed microaggressions, typically defined as the everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and insults of other that people of color, women, LGBT populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions. It was something our trainer took a great deal of time to address. They used an analogy of mosquito bites to illustrate the way the effects of microaggressions compound over time. One bite is no big deal, they explained. However, when you're constantly being bitten by mosquitoes all day long, and when it seems that they're biting you specifically, the pain and irritation, and when it seems that they're biting you specifically, the pain and irritation from those bites are going to add up. Are going to add up. sorry, I'm making sure I'm checking the chat. Can you all hear everything okay? Just making sure I can hear. Okay. So he's saying the pain and irritation from those bites are going to add up. So he's describing how the trainer um, was describing the concept of microaggressions as mosquito bites. Eventually, you're going to reach a breaking point, which may cause you to lash out. Okay. That last mosquito may not have meant you harm. Maybe none of them did. But it's not about what they meant. And it's not just about that one bite, it's about the cumulative toll of them all. Okay. All right. So this is the trainer explaining the concept of microaggressions. Isn't him taking that viewpoint, just so we can be clear. So I found this to be very I found this to be a very apt analogy. We've all been in similar positions where our patience is depleted and we find ourselves exploiting or exploding on someone who may have very little or nothing to do with why we're upset. It's a human thing to lose one's temper, to misinterpret a joke, or comment and respond harshly, or to take our bad day out on someone without realizing that's what they've done. Pardon me. I am dyslexic, just so you know. So my reading this is actually a profile in courage for me. So I think I'm doing okay. But if you have a mix up, just go ahead and read with me. It's also just as human to be on the receiving end of those outbursts and to feel mistreated or unfairly maligned as a result. Perhaps by employing more compassion and understanding, I thought we can learn to navigate these issues together. But our trainer didn't take the analogy to that conclusion. Instead, he left it at the explanation for lashing out. This, in effect, rendered it a justification, not just for overreacting to a minor infraction, but also for punishing one person for the infractions of others. Think about the implications there. Okay, so he continues and he's drawing a bright line distinction between, okay, maybe the analogy of mosquitoes is apt and actually has some truth to it. But he's basically what he's articulating here is that there is a justification for impact over intent because the person who is receiving the microaggressions, as they explained it, then has the right to lash out, and then it ends there. Okay, and that's a good distinction that I think he's moving forward with. So, and he's talking about microaggressions here. And Angel continues. He said, think about the implications there. Let's say I, a person of color, experience microaggressions from 20 white people. Let's ignore for now the obvious role that subjectivity plays here. Okay. The first 19 instances, I keep quiet and brush off despite my hurt feelings. The 20th, however, is my breaking point. As person or trainer, it is now not only understandable but justified for me to blow up on this person, taking my frustration out on them, despite their individual offense being small and possibly unintended. Okay. So he's drawing a distinction here, and he's making a point that what about all the other 19 before, and then the last person receives the whole full force of your frustration if you take into account or you buy into the concept of microaggressions as being 20 mosquito bites. Okay, holding an individual responsible for the perceived behaviors or traits of the group they belong to. What does that sound like? I wondered that to myself during our training, but kept quiet about it. Later in the day, we were given worksheets, each describing a different scenario involving microaggressions, bias, and outright bigotry. Our task was to take 5 minutes, come up with the best approach to handling the scenario, and report back. He's moving, and I'm going to kind of just read through this. Like I said, I don't like critiquing a person's piece without giving you the full context. And I'm going to focus specifically on the premise of the piece. But I want to make sure that you have the full context to know that there's a lot here I agree with. But that's why I feel like I need to read the whole piece if I'm doing a video on it. So, and it's a good pace. You should go read it yourself and give him a like and share your thoughts in his comment section on Substack. So, but let me continue with what he's saying. So, he's talking about the piece in his worksheet. So, He returns the worksheet. My worksheet described a racialized white man who habitually confuses the names of two racialized black women in the office. The responses from my coworkers were exactly what you'd expect. This white guy needs to be sat down and chastened for his racism. He needed to be alerted to his privilege and needed to atone for his error. He should take a DEI training like the one we were all participating in. In fact, the company should mandate it. I raised my hand. And this is Angel speaking, said, I raised my hand. I started telling everyone the story of the office assistant and her gasps and groans when I described the mistake he had made. The thing is, I interrupted. Okay, so or the thing is, I interrupted. So he's speaking to the group that's in the DI training that they just turned in the worksheets for. I think I know how. I think I know why that had probably happened, and it wasn't racism. Okay, so he's challenging the base premise of microaggressions as or implicit bias, as they would describe it, as racism itself. Okay, I explained that this guy had only recently started working there, and he delivered mail for our entire office, something like 150 people. I realized that he had never had time to speak with or get to know anyone beyond a few quick greetings, and popped in and out as he popped in and out. If he had learned more about the Korean woman than her superficial characteristics, if he had known her hobbies and interests, for example, he probably wouldn't have confused her with the other Korean woman in the office, who likely had different ones. If he had known either of them as people, no amount of physical similarity would have led to confusion. Okay. All right. So he's making a great point here that there might be other reasons for this than just some kind of systemic racism or implicit bias, that there could be an actual practical reason for it. And he says later, he continues, if I were in charge, I said, I would recognize this as a lack of company cohesion. Okay. So he's making the point that it could be company cohesion could be responsible for this. All right, so he's taking and putting it back on the company, which is something the company doesn't want, which we'll get to my point later, that DEI is all an attempt to remove company liability and company responsibility for anything that might happen at any given point in terms of conflict between two groups of people, however they may define it at the time. But I digress, because I want to give you the full context here of what he's saying. He says, if I were in charge, I would recognize the lack of cohesion. I read that part. And he said, my proposed solution was to institute a set of meet and greets for the entire staff as part of the onboarding process. This would help coworkers and new employees get to know one another more deeply, even if they didn't get to see each other all the time. I was certain of that. Once they knew, he was certain of, I was certain that, sorry, once they knew each other better, that kind of situation would hardly ever rise again. The response from the trainer and everyone else was bizarre. It wasn't that they disagreed or thought my suggestion was a bad idea. They thought nothing remotely like it had occurred to them. It's that nothing remotely like it occurred to them. Given the framework that they were in and the lens in which they had spent the day being trained to see through, what I had called for wasn't even in the realm of possibility. Everyone went straight to racism as the explanation for the office assistant's behavior, and they jumped right into the opprobrium as the proper intervention. They had responded to someone being reduced to assumptions, stereotypes, and superficial characteristics by doing the exact same thing to someone else. Okay. And let me interject here, and I there's only so much more. And he kind of continues with that his basic point is that DEI, as it was being trained at the moment, or the DEI training itself, was training these workers to view things through a certain lens. And because of that lens, all of the training that happened before that, his point of view that this could be for a different reason, a different practical reason wasn't even thought of. And that's true, right? That's absolutely true. Okay. But herein lies my issue. I'm going to skip down because I know I'm losing some people, but herein lies my point. He says, I'm not against DEI trainings, not in principle. There are plenty of issues in our society that need addressing, including issues of racism and intolerance. Bias and bigotry are real issues, and they can sometimes go either unnoticed or unaddressed. There is a role for programs and protocols uh, that call out mistreatment and misunderstandings between coworkers, blind spots in hiring practice, and structural issues that inhibit individual progress in ways that are constructive rather than presumptive, resentful, and retributive. Okay. And so, so herein lies my issue with this piece. He says diversity, equity, and inclusion need not divide, essentialize, and inflame. That last phrase is where I find issue with the piece. Okay. The words, the very words diversity, equity, and inclusion, as defined by the DEI industrial complex, are inherently divisive, especially the words equity and inclusion. Okay? If you take the words DEI as a unit, the heart of that is equity. Equity, let's define what equity means in the context that it is used and is known and is practiced. The more important part, that it is practiced throughout our society across institutions, public and private. See, that's the dangerous part about DEI as a unit right now, is that it's fusing together a membrane of public and private institutions under a specific political ideology. And I think what he's trying to do here is reclaim those words. And the danger of that is that the DEI political apparatus, as it functions in our society, is wholly corrupted. It is designed in every institution for which it is to push a Marxist identitarian political viewpoint, and then to weaponize that viewpoint towards moving that organization towards a specific Marxist identitarian political goal. Okay? And it does that by weaponizing policies through these kind of struggle sessions, because people implement policy, right? People promote, implement, and enforce policy. So if you can, the goal of DEI as an apparatus and the DEI officers, they serve as political thought commissars, and they do that under the moniker of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when he says up here, when Angel says, I'm not against DEI trainings, not in principle. One, he is accepting the premise. He's accepting a premise that is very dangerous. First of all, he's including equity in this notion. And equity, again, requires discrimination on the front end through anti-racist policies as defined by Ibram Kendi, to engineer equal outcomes on the back end by implementing discrimination in policy based on race, color, creed, gender, all of those things, to engineer that outcome on the back end. And that, what we must understand is that DEI as a unit is built around that concept of equity. And so what FAIR, I think, is trying to do, what Angel is trying to do, and I know FAIR is trying to do some of this as well, is they're trying to reappropriate those words. Okay? And reappropriating those words is dangerous, because those words were meant as traps. I encourage everyone to read, now I'm blanking on it because I wanted to, and I should have written it down, but I thought, I would remember. Counter Wokecraft by Charles Pencourt. That's on New Discourses with James Lindsay. Go find it. You can order it there. It's on Amazon. And he talks about this in this book, about how the words specifically diversity, equity, inclusion, microaggressions, anti-racism, all of these words are designed by the people who employed them first in the context of these institutional trainings. They're meant to be traps. Let me illustrate this for you. So diversity 10 or 15, 20 years ago was more along the lines of understanding what we knew the Martin Luther King's not by the content or the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. That we need to be as empathetic and sympathetic and as treat others the way you want to be treated, right? And that concept of diversity was used in a pretty good way, but that if you noticed over time, and we've seen the progression of this, which actually really began in an institutional manner across public and private when Barack Obama in 2011 signed an executive order mandating that all the federal government institute DEI officers and committees throughout the federal government, knowing Barack Obama, who is a he's a woke leftist. Regardless, his actions speak louder than his words on that subject, and the direction he has gone since then. He implanted this into the federal government, and the mode was to change the political thought via policies through these one-on-one, interpersonal, and group struggle sessions. But he called it diversity and inclusion. Right? So we went from diversity to diversity and inclusion. Inclusion meaning that the explicit action item of that is in the hiring process, that we must place the immutable qualities of the people we're hiring before they get in, right? That we must place them above many aspects of merit or many aspects of other considerations. Even down now where it's moved to the lack of double-blind auditions in music groups, right? That you have to actually seek out people to make sure that you have an equal representation, right? Well, but here's the problem. So we went from a diversity 20 years ago to diversity and inclusion, which automatically was anti-racism or in hiring practices. Now they've since in the last 4 years added the equity piece. Equity is the mandate. James Lindsay talks about this. You use diversity and inclusion to get to equity. Equity is the goal. It's the heart of the whole thing. Equity meaning equal outcomes on the back end, but that's just the surface layer. Real equity, the way that it's actually practiced, is a homogenization of political thought within the institution that places this idea above all other things, right? And so when he says, I'm not against DEI trainings, not in principle, he's already lost the argument. That's my point. He makes great points about microaggressions. I disagree with a little bit of the way he couches it, but it's all in good faith, and you can tell that. But he's already lost the argument. FAIR has already lost his argument. I know they're coming out with trainings, and they have good intentions behind them, but they're trying to reclaim words that are meant as bait for you to try to reclaim, because they know that, especially now over the last 10 years, and again, Barack Obama signed that EO in 2011, and universities have been implanting this for on and on before that time, right? They know that the law of averages, as the hiring, as the inclusion piece is brought in, right? They know that they're going to swarm you, that they have the institutions. And so trying to convince organizations that you can get a better DEI, I'm not saying it's not possible in the short term, right? FAIR could come in with its fair medicine, it could come in with its DEI trainings, it could come in with these things. But the problem is that FAIR, if they call it a DEI training, if Angel would call it a DEI training, if other people with a better intention would call it a DEI training, it's only a matter of time before you're taken over ideologically. And if you're using that language, it's already there. All they have to do, that's the problem with a lot of this this half measure. And I think this is a progressive blind spot. This is a classically liberal blind spot. And I am not, I want to point this out. I would have considered myself classically liberal. I'm a right leaning center conservative. Okay. I'm an independent. I'm not a Republican. I have issues with as anybody who follows my Twitter or have heard, I have issues with Republicans, specifically on, things like school choice that I've been open about, and the way that it might end up into a corporate end of things. But this feeds into that actually. And I have a concern with FAIR's grabbing of this DEI apparatus, because I think, well, I hope, and I don't want to cast aspersions, but I hope that it's not an effort to make money. I hope that it keeps sincere. And if they're going in this on good faith, I will take them at good faith. But to not recognize or to not see that there is a point in the fact that this apparatus is already strong within institutions, and that the DEI moniker across institutions is a bulwark. It's high walls that you're trying to infiltrate them. You may get one or two people or one or two programs in the clothing, so to speak, and try to take that over. But once they find you out, they're going to expel you. That's the problem. And so when you accept D, E, and I as a unit, because D, diversity was the cudgel, it was the carrot. I is the mechanism of anti-racism in policy, which again, please actually read How to Be an Anti-Racist. He defines anti-racism explicitly in terms of public policy. You can only be anti-racist if you are for policies as he defines them. And he defines them in terms of equity. And equity is equal outcomes. Do you see the road that you're flying down? This is why we have to be very, very careful. And I think it just starts with not accepting their premise. If you accept their words, you accept their premise. They teach you this in political training. I've worked with political candidates. I've worked with people in the media, and you can see it all over the media. Especially watch a presidential debate, right? If you see the presidential debates or the White House press secretary or any press secretary for any campaign, if a reporter asks you a question or a moderator asks you a question that you do not like, right, or that you patently disagree with, if you try to answer, it's couched in a trap, right? They couch it in a trap, like kind of the I'm trying to come up with a concise example, but the when I think it was Mondale, it may have been Dukakis, was asked, if your wife was raped, why, and I don't think I could say that on YouTube, so I'm sorry. If your wife was taken sexually, if your wife was harmed in that way, how would you react? And he got in trouble for that because it was stilted, but he also accepted the premise, right? He accepted the premise of the question. If you accept the premise by accepting the language, you lose the argument automatically, because then you're fighting the ideological argument on the battlefield of their choosing. And they've outlined that battlefield. Let me make this clear. They've made that battlefield to where they have the high ground and you have the low ground. If you accept diversity in conjunction with equity and inclusion, if you accept that as, and I think if you accept that as fait accompli, you lose. And I think FAIR is being sincere. I hope that they are. I hope this isn't just a money-making scheme. But and again, I'll have Angel and anybody on to talk about that end of things. But they must recognize, everyone must recognize that if you accept that premise through the language, you automatically lose. Over time, you will lose. And because you will just be outnumbered. And let me couch this with one of my main issues with the school choice argument, right? Is that and it follows the same logic, and this may not make any sense to you, but my mind works a little differently. That the idea is that we take kids out of public schools and put them in private schools, and but they at once say that that's not to kill the public schools. Which, if that's their goal, that's the goal. I would just assume they'd be upfront with that. There's at least a point there, but then they say, you know, that that will make all schools better, but they don't. They admit that most people will still be in public schools, right? And that's how conservatives lost the culture war now. That's why they're, it's that all of the mainline conservatives are the really more religious conservatives, a huge chunk of them after the 60s, excuse me, and the prayer in schools pulled their kids out and put them in different kinds of schools, homeschooled them. And so their influence in the culture was gone. And so the left and the Marxist left had a rough shot over the last 40 years to train people to think a certain way and accept certain things that lent us to where we are right now. And that is my problem with this. It's that same concept. Okay. You have to be against DEI because it has been defined. It's been defined in both. And you're accepting this surface level definition of it instead of, Angel, and I'm just going to talk directly to you. And again, I want to have you on here. If you want to come, if not, if you don't want to give this argument any credence, fine, or just my little channel, that's fine. But I've earned my bona fides on these subjects, and I've got a bit of a following to prove it. So if you want to talk about it, please come on, and I would love to have a good faith discussion with you. But if you accept that, you lose. You just automatically lose. Over time, you will lose. And the reason for that is because when you use those words, DEI, you accept the practice of inclusion, which is rooted in discrimination in hiring. You accept their underlying premise that everyone needs, that the institution must force people to be empathetic. You in a way accept their premise that the institution must micromanage the microaggression, right? That's the other part of it. DEI is a micromanagement of human behavior. And this goes back to how we've started micromanaging kids in institutions. And Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his The Coddling of the American Mind, that if you leave kids to the process on their own of their own conflict resolution, right? Then largely they 9 times out of 10 they will come to a better resolution than if they're micromanaged and forced to say something. Why? Because they end up hitting each other's buttons, right? But they also learn through that process how to interact with people. And I think one of the base issues of DEI, the way it set its own premise that we need this, is because we stopped letting kids over the last 20, 30 years do their own conflict resolution at a young age. So by the time they get to, right, the institution or the workplace that you're describing, they're unable to, one, deal with a certain unintended slight, and two, if there is an unintended slight, it's weaponized against one to the other at a threat to the institution, right? And the first thing they do is go to the HR person and basically tattletale. And it's like, well, part of the reason I think Angel was describing that he could have this more comfortable feeling with his friends at the beginning of the article, right, was that they had a mutual understanding. And I'm sure that those interactions were often involved some kind of conflict, but they figured out how to figure that out on their own without some commissar micromanaging that situation, which the whole point of that micromanagement, I just want to point this out, is to protect the company itself. The DEI industry has convinced public and private alike that they are necessary in the market to protect companies from their workers. That is a huge cudgel here. And they do that because of, I mean, this goes into a bunch of different issues, but that the whole idea of harassment in general, that, and they keep whittling it down. And that's what microaggressions, and I'm glad that he addresses that. But he also accepts the premise that they need a company sponsored third party to train them in whatever direction. If you accept the premise that you need to be trained to deal with your own interactions as an adult between people in the workplace or outside of the workplace, then you are then accepting the premise, and you are giving up power for people to be able to do that in either direction that they want. So then it becomes just a matter of who has the most numbers and who has the institution as to which political, moral, social ideology will run primacy, will have primacy within your institution. You see what I'm saying here? Does it make any sense? And I have Wikipedia snippet saying, yes, making mountains out of molehills. Yes, that is a part of it. That is a part of it. But, and I'm sorry, guys, I'm not used to this, having people just actually in here. I usually am talking to an empty room. So if you have something to say, please say it. I'm looking at it now. I was reading the article. I don't have double screens. So, but I hope I'm making my point in a way that I'm not trying to, I'm not impugning Angel's intentions or Fair's intentions at this point. Definitely not Angel in this article. I have some issues with Fair's adoption of DEI as a unit, but I have no proof of that, and I would be willing to talk to them. I've talked to them about it before when I was involved with the institution. So I just think that, again, that's a stacked incentive. I'm not going to use a slippery slope, but it's a stacked incentive towards doing this kind of thing for just making money. But that's where progressives really have a blind spot, is that they try to be so tolerant. The real classically liberal progressives that are sincere about that mode of thinking, that I think we have all accepted in a large way, to be as tolerant as you can without the imposition of that tolerance upon you and your personhood and the way you act all the time, right? Or your speech or your thought or all of that. That's good. But there comes a point where progressives have to realize something. Progressives have to realize that what was weaponized against them. And it was their specific beliefs that weaponized it, and now it's being monetized. And once something like that is monetized to a systemic extent, right? That's now the incentive. And the incentive is couched. I mean, there are, whether you want to talk about INCOR at the University of Oklahoma or all these other DEI apparatuses that are specifically not just devoted to DEI as a money-making process, but DEI as a political tool. I want to bring up what CO Sophia just said here. And I can't read it, actually. Oh, no, she said, no, I see your point. I have to send you Darian Abbott's alternative vision called MFE, Merit, Fairness, and Equality. Okay. And I just recently spoke to Jason Littlefield, who has kind of the same kind of concept. And I pushed back on him, and in these, in the kind of the same way I'm pushing back on this article. I know Jason intentions are good, but using their tools and their systemic apparatus it's just, you're setting yourself up for failure because they know it better than you do, right? They do. And they're stronger. And as to where people 20 or 30 years ago, people our age that fight back against this, We're systemically trained at a young age to think of content of character over color of skin, to think of not impact over intent, but intent over impact. That to give people the concept of charity, this was something that was ingrained in us at a young age. People have to realize that over the course of the majority of students that are coming up through these institutions now, it's inverted. And so you using the DEI concept, when these students and these younger people get into, who have been systemically trained to think this way, get into your institution and you're doing this great DEI model that may have good intentions and be good in terms of treating people, you've already lost the argument because you've given up the apparatus. And I know I keep saying that, but I think it's a point that needs to be hit over and over again, because they will then push you out, or they will use that apparatus to go to the administration, to go to the people who own the company, to go to the people who make the decisions, to push you out, because then you are the liability to the company. Does that make sense? This is the ESG of it all. Companies, to make money and to keep their bottom line intact, will freely remove people who they pose as a threat to that concept. And if they, at any point, if the DEI apparatus can convince the higher ups that you, black, white, female, male, trans, doesn't matter, are a threat to that bottom line, you're done. You're gone. And that can ruin your career. That can ruin your life. It can ruin your livelihood. And by accepting the DEI as a concept, even trying to implant it in an institution under the guise of good principles, same with SEL, by the way, you're taking the bait. You're taking the bait. So when Angel says here, diversity, equity, and inclusion need not divide, essentialize, and inflame, I disagree. Diversity, and specifically the equity and inclusion ends of it, because, and I want to just point this out, inclusion, critical race theory, and I say this all the time on my channel, critical race theory is derived from critical legal studies. Inclusion has a specific legal meaning, and the Supreme Court has identified that as to include one is the implicit exclusion of another. They flipped it on you. You are taking the colloquial version and now trying to reimpose the colloquial version of that term, but by ignoring the legal operational version of that term. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you've now unified them, DEI, is designed and must, as its unit, as its purpose, divide, essentialize, and inflame. That's all it was designed to do. That is all it was designed to do. And so for my good faith progressive friends, to my center left classical liberal friends, all I would ask is this: I will take you at good faith. Do not get into this business to make money. That's the first thing I ask. And now I'll take that as being, that's not the purpose, that you really want to do what you say you're going to do. Look at the reality beyond the primacy of what you think. Look at the reality of what's coming at you in 20 years. Because the students today are not being taught what you were taught as a kid. And they called this the long march through the institutions for a reason. And don't think that this major dust up, this Trump, this kind of a Trump inflamed early exposure of themselves and what they really think as the end of that march. because it's not. It's not. As kids, we were taught not by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. We were taught that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights had a certain unracial, unidentity based quality that even surpassed those who participated in slavery. That's the only reason we're making a fight right now, is because we believe that as kids. A majority of your students in 20 years that are going to be in the workforce, that are going to be in college, that are going to be entering the political sphere will not have learned that. They will not have learned it. That's a fact. So it's all being replaced by DEI. And they're going to view DEI as this specific mode of thinking. And if they encounter you later on, that you've implanted into this company now and it stays there for 10 years and then they get hired, it's a dangerous thing. Don't adopt their language. Come up with something different. But I would also say don't adopt their mechanism. Do not accept the premise that we need DEI training to teach us how to interact with each other as adults, much less children. If we train our children how to interact and problem solve on their own when they're young, they won't need this when they're older. And if there's any merit to school choice, I'm hoping that there's some of that that comes out of it if in these places that it happens. But the problem is that this notion of DEI is being put in there too. Your incentives are stacked against you, monetarily, economically, socially. That's my point. And yes, Sia Sophia, that we were doing decently with that before this mess of DEI. That's right. But I would remind everyone, and I'll just show that. So yeah, thank you for watching, by the way. She's a very busy, very smart woman, and I appreciate that. But they have changed everything so fast, out from under our feet. And I'm a teacher. I've been in the classroom. I've been in the grade school classroom, been in the high school classroom, been in the college classroom for the last 4 years, 5 years. And the changing is markedly different. Wholesale, a majority. So, Angel, thank you for the great article. I think it was, I understand your point. I just disagree. Fair, thank you for your work. I think you've got a good mission. Just please keep it about the actual goal that you had when we started and not about making money off of this apparatus. DEI is a master of institutional takeover. And fair, you're an institution. I want to say this. There is something to the premise that we have to ingrain something else, a thought. And I want to be fully try to steelman this in the parts that I really agree with fair. That there has to be something there. But it cannot start. You're trying to train adults. And I understand trying to go across the spectrum. I get that too. I think there's validity in that. But it cannot come couched with these words. It just can't. You will lose every time. You will lose every time. I think part of being a conservative is understanding that sometimes some of these inclusive policies and inclusive things need to be actually rolled back and the premises need to be rejected. Because progressivism progresses. It has no other, by definition. And if you either have to accept, you can't progress in the center. You can't keep. Then you've become conservatives, progressives, by the way. Sometimes you have to reject false premises. And that's all rooted in your language. So I hope I didn't ramble too much. I hope I didn't repeat myself too much. If you like what I did here, please like, subscribe, and follow my channel. Hit the bell. Share my videos. I'm trying to grow this channel. I'm trying to get this out from a more common sense viewpoint and just also speak my voice about it, which I think I have a lot of at least experience with it, if not outward knowledge. In-depth, ideological, philosophical. I'm no James Lindsay, but I believe I have something to offer. If you do too, like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or put them in the chat. If you want to come on the show or you want to talk about this, again, Angel, please come on. If you're watching this, good article, great writer. Let's talk about it. Cool. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you again soon.